Perceived Pressure tells stories in the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We recognise that their sovereignty has never been ceded. We recognise that First Nations Australians were the original storytellers of this land and acknowledge the profound and ongoing contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to our collective sporting fabric.
Sam Lewis, Angela Christian-Wilkes, welcome to Perceived Pressure. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having us. My God, what a day! What a couple of hours! What a week! What a tournament!
It's really big day. Really big day to be sitting down with two football experts and chatting football mid-Asian Cup. I guess I was going to start this with let's sit down. I was expecting it to be relaxed. And I was expecting us to sit down and have meander through into current affairs and start with a history of the Asian Cup and the significance of it to women's football and whatnot. It feels a bit weird to start like that. And so I guess maybe the issue of the day, being the Iranian women's team and everything that is happening with them. I think we should maybe start there. So as we go, I say as we record, not as we go to air, but as we record, the Iranian women's team, 5 of them have been granted humanitarian visas and have sort of made a daring escape out of their Gold Coast hotel. As you guys were getting here, we've sort of seen scenes on the Gold Coast. I don't know whether you've seen this, of some of their players sort of being pulled onto a team bus and being sort of under police escort, sort of on their way, it appears, to the airport from Raw Pines there on the Gold Coast. So I guess, Sam, walk us through you've been covering this in some depth, where, how did we get to this position where they are sort of the centre of the football universe and the centre of sort of the face of, for a brief moment, internationally, the sort of Iranian women escaping the regime?
Yeah, this has been a story for a while. I remember I first started asking questions when the protests broke out across Iran, the anti-government protests and the subsequent crackdown by the authorities on those protesters. Knowing that Iran had qualified for the Women's Asian Cup and therefore would be coming to Australia in just a few months' time, I was pretty concerned about the welfare of the players. I started asking around to a few different contacts of mine in various football bodies, governing bodies, the local organising committee, trying to understand where they were. That was my guiding question. Where are the Iranian women players? And no one could tell me. And so that in itself was pretty worrying. This is a national football team that's qualified for a major continental tournament, and none of the footballing authorities generally had any understanding of where they were or how they were doing. So slowly I started to do some more digging and was connected to more and more contacts, particularly some Iranian journalists who were working internationally, who had connections with the players, with the team, and had been covering it for a lot longer than me. And increasingly, the closer that the tournament got, and the more that the sort of time crunch became real for the players to arrive in Australia, there were some serious questions about whether they would come at all. Very few people knew where they were. There was very little information coming out of Iran because they had that massive internet blackout during the protests. And so it was kind of just a matter of sitting and waiting and seeing whether they would get here. And they did. And so, I think very slowly at first, more and more journalists covering the Women's Asian Cup began asking questions about the team in the broader context of what was happening back in Iran. But I think the thing that sort of tipped the scales a little bit was in their first pre-match press conference before their opening game against South Korea, where an Iranian Australian journalist asked a question about how they felt about the killing of the Ayatollah, which had happened only hours before that press conference. And the question was effectively shut down. And that sort of started the snowball rolling around the world, paying more and more attention to the plight now of the Iranian players as they progress throughout the tournament. And as we've seen, over the past 24 hours, 5 of them have now sought asylum and been accepted with humanitarian visas. Potentially more will be coming as well. And yeah, by the time this episode goes to air, that number may have risen as well. So yeah, it's been a pretty extraordinary story. For me, it's the story of not just the tournament, but it's been sort of the story of the moment, of global geopolitics and the kind of dynamics and tensions and contradictions and hypocrisies that we're currently seeing played out on the global stage, all of it triangulated through, these young women's soccer players who just wanted to come to Australia, some for the first time, and represent their country on the pitch. And now they've been, swept up in this much bigger storm around them.
Is there, I guess, what's your view on how, I guess I was going to say there's a couple of elements to this. There's all sorts of moving parts to this. I find it fascinating domestically that from a political perspective, there are very few immigration issues that are bipartisan outside of like not wanting refugees to come here as a general principle. And the coalition were the first to lead on this and came out and said that Iranian women's footballers should be given humanitarian visas, which is quite a remarkable departure of principle from the coalition, generally speaking. I guess why is it that and the government sort of subsequently acted very quickly, and we've seen photos of the Home Affairs Minister sort of in what appears to be a hotel room in the middle of the night with 5 of these footballers. Why is it that it sort of has moved so quickly and with such sort of bipartisan support, do you think?
Well, this morning when Anthony Albanese and Tony Burke made statements about what had happened and sort of announced that these players had been granted asylum in Australia, they mentioned that the government had been aware of this for some time and working on this for some time. So that suggests to me that it wasn't just in the last few days that they sort of sprung into action as a result of being called out by the coalition, for example. Like they were probably already doing this work very quietly for a while, which is great. It's exactly what you would want a government to be doing in a situation like this one, where, a group of people are coming to the country and there is a very real risk or very real possibility of them wanting to claim asylum here. So it's great to see that there seem to have been some processes in that have worked. In terms of the bipartisan support, I mean, again, like this team, these players are they've become a bit of a symbol for this bigger political conversation about the war in Iran by the US and Israel and all the kind of allies geopolitically, internationally that are swirling around that. What politicians say publicly obviously is not just what they want to say. There are always intentions and motivations and agendas to what they say in that way. But you're right, like it's quite odd for the right to come out and support the asylum claims of these Iranian footballers when traditionally they have been opposed to this very thing. And depending on how we want to view the role of Australia in the bigger scheme of the US allyship and their involvement in what's happening in Iran now, they would have to make some pretty calculated statements, I think, to try and sort of navigate very delicately those power lines. So yeah, it's unusual and it's a shame, to be honest. Like to politicize players like these, they're always the ones who are the victims in the end.
Is there a sense you get, I guess, on this dynamic of players seeking asylum through international competition generally? It's sort of obviously not uncommon at every Olympics. Typically, this sort of rears its head in some respect with different actors. But is there a sense? Notice there was a mention that Tracy Holmes mentioned briefly, sort of in her reporting on this, that the Department of Home Affairs has like major event contracts and has clauses within those contracts that essentially say that if there's an understanding or a risk or a foreseeability of players using the tournament or using that major event to seek asylum, that or to remain in Australia sort of on a more permanent basis, that sort of the contractor, organizer, etc., has sort of a contractual obligation to sort of alert Home Affairs and fundamentally make their life more difficult and make that process more difficult. Is that something that has just sort of been overridden or disregarded in this respect, or does the Asian Cup not have that, or do you have any sort of understanding of how those sort of clauses work?
Yeah, I saw that reporting as well. I can't speak to its validity because I haven't verified it, so I don't know what kinds of major event contracts were or weren't signed by the local organising committee or the AFC, the Asian Football Confederation, who run the Asian Cup. I don't know how that sort of interlinks with the usual asylum seeker processes, which have been largely reported on in that, players need to be the ones who seek the asylum themselves. It can't be done by an intermediary. It can't be done by an ally or an advocate. It has to be done by the athlete. And that has been the biggest challenge in this circumstance because according to all the reporting, these players have been surrounded by a sort of bubble of control and silence, and they have not been allowed to access external support until this moment where clearly there was some kind of connection made to the players that allowed them to seek asylum themselves. But in Tracy's reporting on that, if it is true that there was some kind of major events contract signed which put the onus on the organisers to take more of a proactive role to protect players, and those players didn't have to seek the asylum themselves, a lot of this drama probably could have been avoided. If there were suspicions that these players would have wanted to stay in Australia for a longer term, the organisers were maybe potentially in a position to be able to action that. And so if they haven't done that, it's either incredibly negligent or that contract wasn't there in the first place. So those are the questions that are sort of emerging for me now, is what were the role of these governing bodies in all of this? Bo Bush, who's the president of FIFPro Asia, which is the Continental Players Union, told us yesterday in a press conference that he was not aware whether the AFC or the local organising committee had done a human rights risk assessment before the tournament, which is something that's quite common. It happened before the 2023 Women's World Cup by FIFA. It was quite a comprehensive one that's done right at the start of the tournament, just before it begins, to assess all of the different risks that all the different competing nations may face and some of the mechanisms that might be required to support them. But Bo reported and said publicly that he had no idea whether the LOC had done one. And so if that was the case, if the organising committee of this tournament did not do a human rights risk assessment and therefore didn't know what the actual risks were to these players and didn't have any mechanisms or protections in place for them in the eventuation of what has now occurred, that is an incredible act of negligence. And I think some really serious questions need to be asked of leadership in those organisations as to why they didn't do more when this was a problem that was coming at them from miles away.
Is there a sense of what the immediate or medium-term future of these players might look like? I know that when it came to sort of Fall Kabul almost 5 years ago now, that the Afghan women's football team sort of have been taken under the auspices of Melbourne Victory, and that's sort of a setup that is happening in Melbourne, and they've sort of developed into their own team down there. Is there a sense of, is there an appetite, you think, for a similar sort of, undertaking here and I guess presumably in Queensland or Sydney, where so many more of the Asian Cup fixtures have been held? Yeah,
so today Brisbane Roar came out and said that they would be very happy to sort of bring the players who have been granted these humanitarian visas into their care, basically, and to allow them to play and train with them, which is fantastic. That's obviously the local A-League club in Queensland. I have very little doubt that football on the ground here in Australia will come to the aid of the players if they want that, which is exactly what happened when the Afghan women's national team landed in Australia as well. Well before they connected with Melbourne Victory, there was a community of football charities and human rights organisations based largely in Western Sydney who wrapped their support around the players and gave them opportunities to compete in local tournaments against local teams, because that's what they wanted to do. They're a football team. They want to play together. They want to stay together, and they want to find community and safety with each other. And so I think it's really important that football in Australia, learns from that and continues to offer that kind of support to the players. not just the ones who have sought asylum, but hopefully the ones also who may be inspired by what their teammates have done and seek asylum over the next couple of hours, days, whoever knows how long they're going to remain in Australia. But if that doesn't happen, and it is just the 5 who have been granted these visas, I have very little doubt that football will wrap its arms around them and make them feel loved and safe as much as we can.
I guess on that slightly brighter note, we might segue into where we are with our own national team and the state of the tournament so far. Angela, I want to bring you in here. I'm conscious that was
there's a lot of talking. I'm sorry.
I can speak to the Afghan women's national team thing, in that I've played against them multiple times in the state leagues in Victoria.
Oh shit.
Yeah, but that Melbourne Victory I think what's ultimately happened, that was such a beautiful landing place for them in terms of being able to stay together and play together. But the program's no longer running through Melbourne Victory, I think, because there is there's a interesting variety in like the skills of the players on the team. So some of them have gone on to like bigger and better things and are playing on NPL teams now and BPL and that kind of thing. So, but in terms of like the short term, I think it was really important for them to have that hub. And my old housemate missed out narrowly on being able to coach against Jeff Hopkins at one point. He was so excited for that bit specifically. But I was actually thinking about all of this and like maybe that would be an eventual outcome. But that was just like speculation from my end. I'm definitely not the expert in all of this, but fascinating stuff.
What I think I can count you as an expert on is the state of play on the Matildas and where we are as we record. I think this will go away right before the knockout stages start again, is Friday morning. Yeah, so they will start up again on Friday afternoon as we go to where the group stage has finished for the Matildas, and we finished second in the group. You and I were at the Korea game last night.
Two nights
ago.
Yeah.
And a lot of emotion, a lot of weird vibes coming out of it. Didn't really feel like a draw. I guess run us through what the expectations were coming into this tournament and where you see them sort of at this midway point.
Yeah, interesting. I think there's like kind of different layers of expectation that kind of emerge when we're looking at this Matildas team and what has been expected of them coming into the tournament, because I suppose there's kind of the internal or like the team based ones. It seemed like they really wanted to top the group, and not necessarily just in a logistics kind of way. It would be lovely for them to have stayed in Sydney. It would be lovely to also stay in Sydney, but that's okay. It's not about me. But I think in terms of just topping the group, that you want that as an athlete. You want to win. Joe Montemurro has talked about the kind of permutations chat and the goals, and that's been brought up in presses, and he's kind of had the front of, or like the position of, we don't really care about the goal difference or that kind of stuff. We just we're winning the games. And so there was this interesting kind of conversation afterwards of that kind of disappointment that was coming from players in the team, as well as like other I guess like punters, and including myself, like the disappointment around it being a draw. And then also in contrast, like for example, I believe it was Elise Keller-Knight on the coverage was saying, oh, well, it's a draw, like it wasn't a must win. But I think maybe, it wasn't a must win, but it was a point of pride, I think. And then the expectations in terms of the tournament as a whole, we can maybe get into the World Cup stuff at a later point. But I think the Matildas, like, they need to get to the final. And so in a way, being second in the group, that's potentially maybe silver lining, giving them a little bit of an easier pathway into the final compared to topping the group. But again, they're athletes. They want to win. They want to do well. And then the expectations, I guess, one of the other things I was thinking about there in terms of the layers is like expectations around Joe Montemurro and what he's been able to do with the resources that he's been given. And the main resource I'm kind of thinking of here is time. And that's not really been much of a conversation, and maybe that's something that will be returned to after the tournament. I think because we kind of need to see how things go overall to be able to make a real assessment there as to whether it's a success or not. But yeah, so far, like I kind of figured this is where we would be. Like I'm not overly surprised that we came second in the group. But does that answer the question? I don't.
Yeah. I guess then, do you think there's, I guess, a bit of a divergence between the public expectation and football's expectation or the private expectation? There's been a lot of discussion around, predominantly from those of vested interests, as it always is, but that's what Tony Jones would take as a comment. There's been a lot of conversation. You and I have had this discussion as well about sort of the promotion of this tournament and the relative profile of this versus the last time the public saw international football, tournament football on these shores, and what that looks like. And I guess we saw some of that World Cup feeling on Sunday night when it was 62,709. And it feels Stadium Australia was I think one of the first games of the tournament at Stadium Australia, and it sort of felt like a tournament again. And again, part of that is if it didn't happen in Sydney, did it really happen? Yeah, I guess, is there a divergence there between what the public expects of the Matildas at this tournament and what football expects of the national side?
That's interesting question. I think it is one of those things when you're in the weeds a little bit more, you're across the finer details, you become more pessimistic, I suppose, or you try to be more realistic. So my perception from I don't know if I can really speak about like what I guess, and this isn't me using this term in a derogatory way at all, but like a casual Matildas fan who might float in and out when they're, and when major tournaments or important games are happening, that's when their kind of interest is peaked a bit more, along with like more coverage of the team and the game. I'm not really sure. I think, but the kind of, I don't want to say it's marketing, but like, the kind of narrative we have around the Matildas that was in a lot of cases intentionally brought with their World Cup campaign around developing momentum for the game at the grassroots level and being role models for the next generation. And, this is an untapped opportunity for Australian football, blah, blah, blah. I think that's been so dominant in the messaging around this tournament. And I have kind of frustrations around that, because it definitely feels like it's like, oh, so we have a major tournament, and that's like, it's like almost like a source of energy or fuel that we'll use to create the momentum to build things up. And so that comparison of like, we had the World Cup and we saw what it did for women's football, and so we've got this amazing opportunity with the Asian Cup and we're going to do it again. And I'm like, and that kind of at the surface level, high level, it removes the nuance around like what actually did happen after the 2023, what happened with the legacy frameworks, what happened in terms of translating that momentum into something more sustainable for growing the women's game. And I think, again, it's like a lot of the 60,000, like the crowd numbers for the Matildas has been fantastic. But again, this is a personal frustration. It like feels like we're always in a position at this point of like having to prove that they're still good and prove that there's still an audience. And I'm like, I feel like I thought we'd be over that hump with the World Cup and be like, it's there. But it's kind of like almost a refresh. And we saw that with like the sellout crowds after the tournament as well. It was like, I don't know, it was working to prove that the Matildas, like people love the Matildas and want to see the Matildas play, and they care about this team. And at the same time, in having that as an argument, it kind of reinforces the argument that they still need to prove themselves and they still need to perform, they still need to get the big crowds. I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense here, but in terms of the expectations, I think the public expectations are like Matildas do well and Matildas drum up interest in the women's game and Matildas do us proud. And I think that a lot of the time the public expectations are a lot kinder. I feel like the expectations for people in football are a bit more critical, but that's again because like for myself and Sam and Harry and Marissa, like in terms of our discussions on the podcast throughout, like last year, which was a rest year, no major tournaments, a lot of those were quite stressful in a way because there wasn't a coach that was appointed until the middle of the year. And so when you're kind of at the coalface from that, at that close proximity, you do have the information that makes you have all sorts of doubts. So I don't know, it might be nice to be a casual. I think it is ultimately very nice to be a casual and to not have to worry about any of that. I think for the most part, the Matildas will, tick the boxes for the majority.
Is there a sense of, I guess I want to touch on this idea of this frustration, this cycle.
Yeah.
And because it's not a unique cycle either. And so I guess this is the thing I'm curious about is to what extent is that, because it's also significantly gendered, I guess to what extent do you think this is sort of a gendered phenomenon versus sort of a representation of a sporting public at large that can be very fickle and can, get around the Socceroos when there's a World Cup on, or, only tune into cricket for 2 weeks of the year, and cricket that happens outside of that sort of goes unnoticed. I think of cricket in particular where, it's, for a lot of it happens in times, and this is relevant for a lot of other sports as well, where it happens in time zones that are not friendly for Australian consumption. And so it just doesn't count. And so, the cricketers fall out of the World Cup out of a group stage, and it should be an embarrassment. And it should be, if it happened on home soil or if it happened in Australian viewing hours, then there would be possibly a Royal Commission. And as it stands, the entire country has collectively decided that we didn't actually like T20 cricket anyway. We've all moved on. Is there, to what extent is this gendered, and to what extent is this just representative of a really fickle sporting public that only gets on board when their team is winning?
That's an interesting question, because I think there's absolutely an element of, the fickle sporting public and, nationalism as well. People love to tap into those warm feelings of being part of a nation state, and there's all this stuff that comes with that. And so in terms of like women's football from a media perspective, the Matildas are always going to have, well, not always, I don't want to be absolute, but at the moment the Matildas are the big ticket items that get priority in terms of coverage. And then when we look at, that's kind of been one of the big frustrations post World Cup, is like the resourcing and the attention and investment into the A-League women's and the kind of wasted opportunity there. That's a big thing. But I think you're right in terms of like that is a phenomenon that goes across so many different sports, in terms of like, if your team is doing well, you're happy to be there. But at the same time, with the World Cup and the Matildas, there was this other thing going on of a lot of people realizing that they could participate in sport as fans in a different way to what they'd kind of experienced in the past. And having the tournament in Australia opened up the game and opened up sport in a significant way to a lot of people that thought that wasn't a place for them. And so there's clips on social media and that kind of thing where people will be at Matildas games and they'll be like, I'm a big lesbian and that's why I'm here. So I don't know. I don't know if it's necessarily, and that again, I think there's been a lot of work from Football Australia and the team who've worked really hard at building the narrative around them in investing in their stories with the athletes and making them relatable and having that point of connection. So even if they do lose or they do badly, people still care deeply. And so I'm not so sure it's like just one thing happening. But in terms of the fickleness of we're happy when we're winning and we're tapped out if we're not, that might not be gendered, but the way that it's taken up to support and justify resourcing for sports teams is incredibly gendered. And it is that dynamic of like, women's teams are only really worthy of coverage. They're only worthy of funding. They're only worthy of like, adequate conditions if they've proven it and proving it through this kind of model of sport is winning. And so I think about like, I've been thinking about the Socceroos and 2022 World Cup. Yeah. And I don't follow the Socceroos that closely, but I had a lovely time jumping on the bandwagon when they did really well in that tournament. But I think maybe the contrast between the Matildas and the Socceroos is that with the Socceroos, I'm not really having any doubts about like if things turn sour for them, that there's things on the line, right? Like they've got the backing. It doesn't really matter. The performance doesn't matter so much for that intersection of like resourcing and that kind of thing. Whereas for the Matildas, like we've seen it with some, interesting think pieces and that kind of thing. There's this like kind of dark side to it all of like an undercurrent of people who are waiting for them to fail because that means that we can just, forget about them and not worry so much about supporting women in sport. And that's scary. And it's like, I don't know how you kind of get over that hill and over that, I guess, like a constant need to justify the existence through performing well. Yeah. I'm just like, this applies to so much as well. I'm like, let women be mediocre. Like women just don't have the space to be mediocre in sport across so many different areas. Yeah. But yeah, including for elite athletes, being mediocre has repercussions, whereas the repercussions for men a lot of the time are just not the same at all. So, yeah.
I guess, and this is, to the floor, is there a sense of, like, I want to touch on this idea of the missed opportunity, right? And I guess interrogate that idea a little bit. Is it like, was it a missed opportunity? Like, have there been failures in governance, failures in strategy over the course of, I guess, when was the World Cup? 23 years ago. Oh my God. Yeah, like over the last 3 years, 2.5 years, that have sort of put the Matildas in this, well, not been solely responsible, but contributed to this sort of, I guess, precarious position that you talk about.
I think what is quite extraordinary about the Matildas is that they have become so beloved in the public that they are sort of immune from the failures that are happening around them. And that's partly also like they have been successful in the past from really sort of 2014, 15 onwards. They have been a successful and competitive international team, largely despite their circumstances, right? Like they had to go on strike in 2015 when they came back from their best ever finish at a Women's World Cup because they arrived back in Australia and they had no contracts. And they were being asked to go to the United States to play a series of friendlies, and they had no certainty about the kind of support they were going to get when they were doing that. And so they said no, they went on strike. And that was a really pivotal moment in sort of the ripple effects and how that has affected the team over the following decade, because it led to a series of collective bargaining agreements and decisions around how we market this team, such that they have now become a huge symbol of women's empowerment, equality. They're now one of the only national teams in the world that has a shared revenue model with their men's national team, Socceroos. So there's a lot of sort of marketing and narrative and celebration, I think, built into how we think about the Matildas as a team. To Angela's earlier point, for a lot of fans, I think it almost doesn't matter how well they perform. It doesn't really matter how well they win. It doesn't even matter if they do win because people love them for different reasons. And that's great because that means that sport has opened up and fandom has opened up to allow different kinds of relationships to form with these players and with this team that doesn't rely on that old model of you got to be successful to be loved. So I really like that. But I do think post Women's World Cup, there were absolutely a series of decisions or non-decisions that were made, which we are still suffering the repercussions of as a sport. I think one of the big ones was in terms of governance. Football Australia had this extraordinary moment to become a leading federation in terms of their governance structure and representation of women. But what we've seen in the past 3 years is actually that they have fallen short of their own 40-40-20 obligations in their constitution to have equal representation on their board. They have less women now than what they did in 23. And then beneath the board level, there's also been a huge clear out of staff members from that sort of era of the sort of James Johnson winning the Women's World Cup bid, etc. That era of absolute boom, we've seen a huge number of women staff members leave. So, like, what's happening there? What is the culture inside that building that has forced this massive regime change, so to speak, which is now resulting in a lot of questions and a lot of concern about the future direction of Football Australia, especially in the wake of this Asian Cup as well. You know, like, they are the host federation of a home continental tournament. They have an incredibly marketable Matildas team who may go on and win the tournament. There is never going to be an opportunity quite like this one for them to capitalise on and to really embed it in the structure of the sport to show that this is not all just, you know, like glitter and marketing slogans and rainbows and like cool social media graphics. You know, they actually do have a really big opportunity now, a second opportunity to embed some of these principles that they have marketed and have capitalised from into the structure of the sport to make sure that we don't actually need a single Matildas glittering team to be the one that drives gender equality forward in the sport. So I think from a governance perspective, there are some really serious issues there. But I think the A-League Women is the other really big one. You know, that was the biggest missed opportunity in Australian football for a very long time. There were absolutely no connections, conversations, or shared strategies between Football Australia and the APL, who run the A-Leagues, in terms of the legacy of the Women's World Cup. They weren't mentioned once in Football Australia's legacy document, and I don't think the A-Leagues even had a plan. They kind of hoped that the organic fandom that had built around the tournament would just naturally transfer to the A-League Women. And we saw some of that at the beginning, you know, like the opening game between Sydney FC and Western Sydney. Courtney Vine was a Sydney FC star. She'd scored that penalty against France, absolute celebrity. So there was a little bit of traction there, but it very quickly started to drop off because the structure and the culture of the league was not set up in order to catch and keep those fans or to keep the money that was pouring into the sport. So again, like, it is extremely rare. I don't think it's ever happened once in women's football where a nation hosts a Women's World Cup and then a continental championship so close together. So football as a broader pyramid, as an ecosystem, has a second shot at trying to make what the Matildas have created for them sustainable in the long term and creating a sport that actually does represent everybody.
Is that, I should say, Angela, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I was just, did I have a thought? Maybe I did. Yeah, I think just it did feel like the analogy that came into my mind, it's like kind of like investing in coal versus investing in like solar or like renewable energy. It feels like sometimes they're seeing the Women's World Cup as coal. And it's like, once you've burned through those good vibes, then what? Then what? Because the thing is, they're not going to, that momentum is not designed to like hang around. It is immediate. It's like a nice sugar hit. You can get something from it, but you need to be able to harness things long term. And we're just, I think that's, and like with the, that was the other thing I was thinking of, like in terms of the sellout, like I think the record breaking crowd was at the Derby in the end of 2023.
Yeah.
With Courtney Vine. Courtney Vine has since made a move overseas. And I think it was kind of just a lot of things falling the right way for her to be at Sydney FC and for them to have a high profile Matilda. Like that wasn't necessarily orchestrated in any meaningful way. But I think we're past the days of having our Matildas playing in the A-League Women as their bread and butter for the most part. And, you know, most of them are overseas playing at like more competitive competitions. And so I think there's been attempts to kind of tap into that as well with like the Arsenal versus A-League All-Stars. But again, the A-Leagues have shifted to more like, this is where future Matildas are made. And it's just not, it doesn't hit the same. And my thinking there isn't just like bring the Matildas back. It's like you have to trust that this product is good in and of itself and invest in it and hype it up for what it is and kind of work from there rather than trying to like, kind of feed off another team's success. And there's been a lot of missed opportunities, I think, with the APL and the A-Leagues. And just one of those, it's like a bit of a stereotypical complaint when you're in soccer, but like just like no one wants to collaborate, like no one wants to work together sometimes, and it's just that's a big generalization. That's not true in all cases, but from the outside looking in, it's like guys just talk to each other.
Just talk to each other.
Just talk to each
why
other.
can't everyone get along?
Yeah, but it's so political. So
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. Anyway, so yep.
It feels like a lot of these are like analogous to the men's competition. Or like specifically when we talk about like player movement and the dynamics of why people show up to watch. And it makes me wonder about whether or not there is value in like removing salary caps, like you're going and opening up, a lot of the moves to sort of open up the A-League are a lot more developed on the men's side of things. And I guess wanted your views on whether that's possible or sustainable or realistic on the women's side of things, because I guess the clip that like is in my head on loop at the moment is like Harry Maguire and Bruno Fernandes watching one man like banging a free kick for Melbourne victory, and I saw Vince Gary mention this, that like apparently because of the time zone difference, it's very common to have A-League football sort of playing around Premier League clubs in the morning, because that's just the only football on the time. And so like that's the relationship that they have to it, of it's where either retired or up and coming players go, and it's a legitimate, I was going to say retirement league, which sounds derogatory, but
but it's real.
It's real, right?
Yeah.
But it like has created like a lot of value for the men's league, and I just wonder, and those conversations around like salary caps or like how much money, I mean, particularly clubs like Adelaide United have made off transfer fees and reinvested that into their youth program and sort of created a business model off of that. Is that realistic for the men's, for the women's? For the A-League women's?
I hop in with
you go.
Yeah. I think we're both thinking like professionalism.
Yes.
Full-time professionalism.
The first thing has to be a full-time league.
Yeah, but I think you said this at the 2019 World Cup. I remember you kind of speaking to that retirement aspect for the A-League women, and that being a potential like way that they could move forward, because we see in the A-League women, it's actually quite funny. Like sometimes, this was maybe around the time when I was really getting into the A-League women, so 2015, 2016, we were getting a lot of NWSL players coming in there off season. Now that doesn't work anymore because they have professionalized and gone full time, and so they're happy to just play the one competition a year. But in terms of like coming to the A-League for a good time, have a good time, go to the beach, like that kind of thing. And then and I feel like who was Cum Dog?
Jason Cummings.
Jason Cummings. He loved being in Australia.
I
right?
love that we have multiple like national level representatives named Cum Dog in different sports.
Yeah, I love that guy. Anyway, but that was like another like hyper focus for me in men's football was Cum Dog, and just like, what is this person? Like, but he loved the lifestyle in Australia. He loved being near the beach. He loved the culture. But obviously he was taken up in quite a specific way by Socceroos fans. But like, so there is a real aspect, like the retirement thing is like so true. We could be doing that, but it's like at the same time the professionalism side of things. That's the before we get carried away with tweaking.
Around the edges with salary caps.
We need to make this a competitive and viable and sustainable option for players who are currently playing. And I'm sure you'll speak more to this, but like, the recent kind of research and reporting from the PFA. So they had I've forgotten the name of it.
Players Vision, Ready for Takeoff.
Ready for Takeoff. I was thinking of rockets. Rocket fuel, another analogy. But the stuff that they did there, and they did their end of season report as well. It's just like we're losing like talent, and we're losing leadership, and we're losing experience because players are like, I've got to pay rent. And once they kind of hit that point of being a grown up in the real world, it becomes a lot harder to do the A-League women's juggle. And so just there would be a lot of teething issues in that transition, but in terms of being able to, like, it's the whole thing that we see in a lot of women's sport. There's like expectations of full-time professionalism in terms of performance, but the resourcing isn't there, and that affects the quality of the competition. It affects the play. It affects people's interest in the league, and it's just like that's kind of one of the big things. And I feel like we bang on about it a lot, but it is a huge thing. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, totally. It's full-time professionalism is the biggest structural issue with the A-League women at the moment. Like, if you are able to shift that competition to a full-time league with full-time contracts, allowing players to be full-time athletes, it has ramifications in every single bucket of the competition. It affects fans, it affects media coverage, it affects commercialization, it affects the actual players who are now finally full-time workers. It affects coaches and staff as well. It creates a virtuous cycle of growth, basically, which is what the Ready for Takeoff Players Vision found as well. That was a report commissioned and produced by the Players Union with like very deep fundamental input from the players themselves. They went to them and did some workshops over the course of 2 years and said, what do you think the A-League women needs to do? And they provided lots of different feedback, lots of different answers to that. But they fell fundamentally into 4 buckets. The first was full-time professionalism. The second was like match day infrastructure and like improving the match day experience for fans. The third was fan engagement as well, and creating more opportunities to engage with fans, to build fan cultures and fan support groups around teams. And the fourth, I'm pretty sure, was independent governance. Because at the moment, all the A-Leagues clubs are governed by a board at the APL level. That board only has a certain number of those A-League club representatives on it. None of them are men. And the only standalone women's team in Canberra United does not have a seat at that table. So all the decisions that are made about the A-League women are being made by men. And their priority is their men's teams. It's not their women's teams. And so how do you break that structure? How do you create circumstances which will enable the A-League women to be the priority, and for all of these different elements to be thought about really seriously, in the same vein as the NWSL over in America, in the same vein as the Women's Super League over in England, the same vein as increasingly a number of leagues around the world which are becoming independent of their men's leagues and discovering that there is a whole new market, a whole new financial ecosystem ready and waiting to support them. How do you do that? So that's sort of the big, I think the golden question for Australian soccer is like, effectively, how do you get these turkeys to vote for Christmas? Because these are the people who are in the positions of power, right? And we don't have any mechanisms to force them to make decisions against their own interests. And it would look pretty bad if those people thought, you know what, we don't want our women's teams anymore. Like, from a sort of PR perspective, that's probably not a great look for them. And some of them probably do believe that their women's teams add something to their whole of club approach. But that's not being sort of lived. That's not being brought to life in the way that they fund or support, resource any of their women's programs. So what's the next step then? Like, what does the future look like for this competition? And what role should competitions like the Asian Cup be playing in accelerating these discussions and in bringing new voices and new money to the table to be able to say, you know what, if you don't want to take care of Canberra United, Capital Football or APL, whoever, you know, me and my very rich entrepreneurial women friends would love a standalone women's soccer team. How can we be part of it? And the APL, Football Australia, like all the different elements of the pyramid and the ecosystem need to be able to come together and agree that the future best direction for the A-League women, and therefore for women's football in Australia, has to be independence. And then once you're all on the same page about that, you can all make collective decisions in the pursuit of that goal.
I think we could. I keep having questions sort of ping to mind, and it makes me realise that we could talk for hours.
Yeah.
But I'm conscious that podcasts as a medium are unfortunately not infinite. And so I think that might be all we have time for today. Thank you both very, very much. It is such an absolute pleasure to have you on Perceived Pressure.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Oh,
Ooh, look at us.
the shared brain cell.